Now I want to give you a list of over 20 contradictions within science. Because a lot of times scientifically minded and rationally minded and atheistically minded people pretend as though only religion has gross contradictions within it, but not science. Of course, this is horseshit. So here's a list of contradictions. Number 1, science says that the brain generates all perceptions, but the brain and science itself and realism itself and objectivity are themselves just perceptions. So according to science, science itself is just a perception and therefore a hallucination, and that actually science is a psychedelic state and nothing more. Because of course, right now you're in a psychedelic state because psychedelics are just neurotransmitters. You've got neurotransmitters, you've got a soup of neurotransmitters going on right now inside your brain, according to science. So therefore, according to science, all of science is just a hallucination. Contradiction number 2 is that science criticizes belief, and yet science is factually 99% belief. That's what science is. Over 99% of everything you know about science is belief. The planet Mars is a belief. Dinosaurs are a belief. The age of the Earth is a belief. The idea that the Earth orbits around the sun is a belief. All these things for you are just beliefs. All the science you learn in school are just beliefs. Contradiction number 3, science criticizes religion for indoctrination and appeals to authority, and yet modern science is taught by indoctrination and appeals to authority. We talked about this in part 2 in a lot of detail. Credentials, Nobel Prizes, status, expertise, the authority that comes from working in an institution like MIT or Caltech or Stanford or Oxford or Harvard. This is all pure appeals to authority. Anytime you're trying to prove science, you're going to appeal to some scientist as an appeal to authority. And of course, everything that children are taught in schools and all the stuff that's taught in universities to undergrads, all of that is pure indoctrination. Of course, it's denied as being indoctrination, but it's indoctrination. The next contradiction is that science claims to be independent of human culture, and yet science can only exist as a culture. Without culture, there is no modern science. Please recognize this. The next contradiction is that science demands proof, yet science cannot prove the existence of an external objective world, of others, of identity, of death, or of object permanence. None of these things have been proven. None of them will ever be proven, and yet science demands proof of everything. I mean, there's no more obvious contradiction. The next contradiction is that science demands proof, and yet science cannot prove its own foundations. Its own methodology cannot be proven using science. The next contradiction is that science claims to be the best epistemology, the best epistemic method, and yet, of course, this cannot be proven. The next contradiction is that science is supposed to be objective, and yet it's obviously being done by subjective, biased, selfish creatures who are engaged in an activity of survival, which has nothing to do with objectivity or truth. The next contradiction is that science denies first-person subjective phenomena, and yet all of science is itself a first-person subjective phenomena. So science is denying itself without realizing that it's doing so. The next contradiction is that science tries to dismiss consciousness as an illusion, even though all of science is occurring within consciousness. So again, a gross self-denial. The next contradiction is that science claims that mathematics is objective, and yet mathematics is obviously completely relative and subjective, because what counts as a number, how you assign numbers to things, is completely relative. For example, what number is this hand? You could say it's one hand. Or you could say it's a dozen different bones and muscles and organs. Or you could say it's millions of cells. Or you could say it's billions of molecules, or you could say it's trillions of atoms, or you could say it's trillions upon trillions upon trillions of quarks, or you could say it's trillions upon trillions and trillions and trillions of strings. So which is it? It can be anything from 1 to trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions. Completely relative, completely subjective. Which number you assign to this hand, and this is true for all assignments of numbers throughout the entire universe. The assignment of number is completely subjective feature, phenomena of the human mind projecting number upon reality. The next contradiction is that science demands formological proof for things, and yet the most groundbreaking science is done not through any kind of proof process, but actually through leaps of intuition. The proof comes retroactively, as we talked about in part 2. The next contradiction is that science eschews faith, yet science has blind faith in its own foundations, in quantification and logic, in scientific method, in the objective external world, in others, self, and mind. The next contradiction is that science criticizes religion for relying on authority, yet it dismisses unorthodox claims within science because it doesn't come from reputable enough scientists. Anytime some idea is rejected or one's mind is close to that idea because it doesn't come from a reputable enough scientist or source, that is an appeal to an authority. Another contradiction is that the truth of science supposedly hinges on reason, and yet reason is used all the time to justify all sorts of false claims. So how can you use reason to ground the truth of science when reason is always used for false claims? Every false claim has reasons behind it. This is a gross contradiction. Another contradiction is that everything must be proven, and yet Gödel and Tarski formally proved that truth exceeds proof, and that you can never prove everything that's true. Patent contradiction. The next contradiction is that science claims to be objective, and yet the bureaucracy of building consensus is a deeply political and institutional and bureaucratic process. How can science be objective when the universities in which science is done are deeply, deeply political? And their first priority is the survival of that institution rather than truth or science itself. Another contradiction is that science claims to be fallible and open to change, and yet when deep errors are pointed out within science, they're denied, and the people who point out these errors are demonized. Gross contradiction. Another contradiction is that science claims to be free of metaphysics, yet it makes many unproven materialist and realist metaphysical claims. Gross contradiction. Another contradiction is that science claims to be purely pragmatic, and yet at the same time, science also wants to claim to be the pinnacle of truth within society and culture. So on the one hand, science, when it's backed into a corner, it says, oh, no, we're just being purely pragmatic. We don't care about the truth at all. Science can't discover the truth. And yet, in culture, it wants to be treated as truth, not as simply something that's purely utilitarian. Another contradiction is that science claims to be open-minded, and yet science rejects any methods and epistemologies outside of itself as pseudoscience. That's not open-minded. Another contradiction is that science claims that God and spirituality are unscientific, and yet, in fact, materialism and realism are unscientific. Another contradiction is that science claims that it is objectively true because it works, because it's practical. And yet, science denies the same justifications for other worldviews and epistemologies which also work and which are also practical. So, when science is practical and it works, then it's true. But when some other worldview is practical and it works, then it's not true. This is gross hypocrisy. gross double standard.